All right. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back. I know it's been about a little while, maybe about 2 months since the last class. It's been a bit of a crazy time. Yeah, I think just on top of everything with COVID and having kids and crazy school situation, plus with like the election, I spent most of October and November and even just volunteering with election and even working on the Georgia election, and it's just been pretty crazy. So I've been kind of delayed, but still sticking with it. Still going to keep on pushing through. It'll probably take most of 2021 to do all these classes, which is fine. Yeah, I'm excited about this still. So yeah, and at the same point too, these classes are a lot longer than I expected. Especially this one. This one's going to be a decent amount. I think there's like over 100 slides and quite a bit of videos. So hopefully this will give you, so take your time, go through it, at your own pace, and then hopefully I'll get back to doing one class a month. That's my goal for 2021. So I'm going to try to stick with that. But yeah. I mean, life is pretty crazy right now, so we'll see. But yeah, thank you. If you're still watching these, thank you all. Appreciate it. Feel free to send me any feedback anytime. Uh, all right, so I'm excited because we're going to be starting a new theme. So I divided all 24 classes into these thematic units. 3 or 4 classes per thematic unit, and this thematic unit is going to be about basically creating and preserving racial segregation. So the next 3 classes are going to be about how we preserve racial segregation and what the impacts of racial segregation. So this one's going to be mainly about this class is going to be about what is racial segregation, the history behind it. We're going to talk about Jim Crow and the 60s and then everything that happened afterwards. But then we're going to spend probably about half of this presentation talking about things like school choice, which is it's important, because luckily we've had a lot of great writers, and like Hannah Nicole Jones. We're going to watch a bunch of videos and read a bunch from this class. A lot of great people have been recording, especially in the last 5 years, just how impactful and hurtful school segregation is, particularly around school choice. Because even though our narrative is, oh, we fixed school segregation back in the 50s, in reality we peaked, our integration peaked in the 80s, and since then has been what was school has been declining back and resegregating. So we're going to talk all about that and how this is really important too, because a lot of times we talk about racism, and it's easy to be like, oh, that's just like that happens in the South, or that happens with race, people wear hoods and stuff. But school choice is mainly, this is like one of the big ones for how liberal areas and Democrat areas are actually perpetuating racism. Particularly like the more Democrat, the more blue states are, the more liberal cities are, like New York City, the worse the segregation is. And actually in the South, it's the South actually has better integration because they're, we'll talk about the history, because they had different history. They had mandates, while we, in the North, we found all kinds of ways around it. So yeah, so we're going to talk about that. And then that next class, we're going to talk about housing discrimination. There's going to be a whole class on that, and banking discrimination and how that's perpetuated, segregation. And then we're going to talk about the third class for this thematic unit. It's going to be about just a variety of different, short history lessons around, different, racist histories that that most people probably don't know about, or at least, or if your only education is from your high school, you probably don't know about. But we'll talk about that, from like standardized testing to gun ownership, to all these different things that have helped perpetuate ultimately segregation. So yeah, but I'm really excited to get started. I think this graphic is so perfect, because when we think about segregation, it's very intentional. When you think about segregation, you open up your book, like a high school book, and you look, I guarantee the first page is going to be some water fountain, picture of a segregated water fountain, and that's really intentional, because that's meant to, even though it was degrading and it's messed up that black people and white people had to drink from separate water fountains. That is just like the tip of what Jim Crow and segregation was really about. And I think this picture captures it perfectly, because it's not just about segregating people. It's also about segregating resources and environmental protections and things like that. So this is from Michigan, from Flint, Michigan. If you don't, if you don't know the history, definitely check it out. Luckily, there's actually they're looking to prosecute the people that did this, but a lot of them really messed up the water supply for very low income Black communities, and because it was low income and Black, it just lasted years, and no one can, as opposed to, I mean, a lot of people will argue if they did what they did to a white community, it would have been fixed really quickly. So I think it's important to understand that segregation just isn't about segregating races; it's also about segregating quality, resources, opportunities, and things like that. So it's about segregating, clean water as when it comes to Flint, Michigan. And Flint, Michigan was like one of like hundreds of low-income Black communities that have pretty terrible water supply. So it's just a tip. But yeah, so we're gonna go ahead and get started on this presentation. Going to click off my video, and we're going to start out with just a couple videos. I think I have like 3 or 4 or maybe 5 videos just to start out, short clips, but each one of these clips kind of talks about a different aspect of segregation. And I want to start out with James Baldwin. This is from the movie that came out, I Am Not Your Negro. If you have not seen this, definitely check it out. It's a fantastic movie about his life and about a lot of just a lot of great clips, a lot of great quotes. But this is a really short one where he talks, he gives an interesting perspective around racial segregation, and this was, I believe during the early '60s.
Most of the white Americans I've ever encountered, really, had a Negro friend or a Negro maid or somebody in high school, but they never, or rarely, after school was over or whatever, came to my kitchen. We were segregated from the schoolhouse door. Therefore, he doesn't know. He really does not know what it was like for me to leave my house, leave school and go back to Harlem. He doesn't know how Negroes live. And it comes as a great surprise to the Kennedy brothers and to everybody else in the country. I'm certain, again, that like most white Americans I have encountered, they have I'm sure they have nothing whatever against Negroes. That's really not the question. The question is really a kind of apathy and ignorance, which is a price we pay for segregation. That's what segregation means. You don't know what's happening on the other side of the world because you don't want to know.
All right, so that was just a short clip, but I think that really just captures, one of the aspects of segregation. Is just completely, segregating the awareness of what's going on, and we're going to talk more about this in the with the civil rights movement, because luckily the civil rights movement, happened at the same time that the TV movement happened. So all these, TVs were suddenly, go into people's houses, and suddenly white people all over the country that have been completely segregated and been told that, Jim Crow is good, was actually, for the first time seeing the violence of Jim Crow, being recorded in the civil rights movement. So that's a big one. It's just about segregation. It's just, segregating, a lot of the negative realities of our country. White people segregating them to the point that they not only don't care, but not even aware of what's happening in this country. And I think that's a definite thing that's happening a lot in this country. So the next clip I want to, a little bit longer, I want to play about Professor John A. Powell. So this is during this anti-Black state violence symposium in 2019. I'm just going to play a short clip. Definitely worth checking out this whole speech. He did an intro speech to this symposium. It's like 25 minutes long, really fantastic. But I want to play a short clip just talking about the segregation beyond just the physical segregation, what it really means.
Again, it's important just when talking about this to sort of think about Blackness in a different way, to think about whiteness in a different way, and to think about state violence in a different way. Because the most extreme form of state violence that we think about is police or the military going into Philadelphia, actually beating up people and arresting people, going into Ferguson with tanks. But the violence happened before that. Because we have segregation. And people sometimes don't understand this. I just read a report saying that in the United States, the most segregated population are whites. And I think that's problematic for a couple of reasons. Because segregation has never just meant separating people based on their phenotype. Segregation is about the distribution of opportunity and resources. And so when blacks are segregated, they're not segregated in a space where there are good schools. They're not segregated where there's grocery stores. They're not segregated where there are roads. They're not segregated where there's high-speed internet. They're segregated from opportunity. They're segregated from resources. So the segregation, when you think about it that way, is a way of distributing largely state-sponsored resources so that one group has it and another group doesn't have it. And the reason that's important is because when people say whites are segregated, they're drawing unprincipled symmetry between whites and blacks. I'm separated from you, you're separated from me. But where I'm separated, I don't have any resources. I don't have water to drink. I don't have food to eat. I don't have schools and roads. And you have all those things. So if we're going to be segregated, I want your segregation, not mine. And so part of what's happening is the hoarding of privilege. It's the hoarding of resources. It's the hoarding of identity itself. So whiteness then becomes associated with good neighborhoods, with good schools, with clean water, with espresso coffee. And then that gets seared into our mind. So the violence then happens not just in terms of the police, but the violence happens in terms of keeping people isolated from resources. And I did a study several years ago on racial profiling. And everyone assumed that racial profiling was the most extreme in Black communities, in Brazil, in South Africa, in the United States, because those communities had more crime and those communities had more drug dealing. It turns out that was not the case. It turns out the most high expression of racial profiling was when Blacks wandered into white neighborhoods. What the police were really doing was keeping people contained for the benefit of another people. So they're already in prison, if you will, even if they can move around. And at some point, it's like, okay, you got out of your space. So I've literally been stopped by police and they said, what are you doing here? You're too close to opportunity. How'd you get so close to opportunity? What happened? This is a white space. And I know I worked on the affirmative action in South Africa and Brazil. And some of what I worked on 20 years ago was eventually adopted. Not necessarily like I suggested it. That's fine. But there's now this thing about, well, those people don't really belong in schools. And this is a quota system. And now they're really Black. And so there's this attack on affirmative action. And it's another way of saying when Black people show up in halls of knowledge, in sites of power, their presence is being questioned. And when whites show up, there's an assumption that they belong there. This is a natural place for whites to be. And then there's a whole narrative around they earned it. They studied hard, they did well on test scores, they earned it. And I sometimes jokingly say they don't realize, they think they deserve it, they don't realize they just happen to be the white person at the white place at the white time.
All right. So I really like that last line. But the thing about that last line is it doesn't mean that necessarily, I mean, this goes back to our white privilege class. It doesn't mean that necessarily people, white people didn't work hard or didn't, you struggle or have problems, but at the same time, they didn't have to deal with systemic racism. They didn't have to deal with, the resumes being thrown out because their name sounded too, African. They didn't have to deal with, discrimination and how, housing housing and employment and police brutality and all these different things. So it's that's what he's talking about when it comes to this myth that we live in a meritocracy, when in fact we live in a racial hierarchy system that benefits others. But I really like this. I played this clip because I wanted to kind of just demonstrate this is going to be a common thing, that integration isn't necessarily a spatial thing. It isn't necessarily a diversity thing. It's more the importance of integration is more about a quality thing. It's more about equality of resources and opportunities, and decent schools, decent hospitals, employment opportunities, parks, access to food, clean water, things like that. That's what really integration is about. Not necessarily, making some, diversity mixture, in each classroom. All right, so they started. I explained this a couple times in the last couple classes, but YouTube, a couple organizations on YouTube has really increased their copyright protections to the point that you can't play their clips in your presentations, which is totally cool. I totally respect that. But I wanted to play a clip from the John, last week tonight, the John Oliver show, where he did a segment on school segregation. It's a really great, kind of covers this kind of like from the start of the whole of integration from Brown to the decline of integration, starting in the 1980s. So, but I can't play this in my presentation, but that just means just go ahead, you can hit pause, either type in school segregation John Oliver into the YouTube, or go on one of these, or go to the People School. I post all the clips of all the movies and on the recording page. So definitely check that out. It's I think it's like a 20-minute clip, but I would recommend just stopping around 14, almost 15 minutes. 14:50 you can stop. But that should give you a really great kind of overview of what we're about to like really dive into during this class. But a couple of things I wanted to just mention and just to pay attention to is this idea. Well, one, with Brown versus Board, it's really important to understand with Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 school case that outlawed Jim Crow and segregation in schools. It's important to understand that under that that law at this point is the idea that separate but equal is unconstitutional, which is something that often happens in a lot of our schools to this day, that we try to separate schools and then just add more funding to the Black schools, when in reality, even living in a white supremacy society, even adding more funding and resources, it still makes it unconstitutional. So that's why integration is important, because that ensures equality. And then also he talks a lot about like the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and how that's left a lot of loopholes. That bill outlawed Jim Crow and segregation, but it also left a lot of loopholes in the North to continue de facto segregation. Mainly with this idea called racial imbalance, where it said, well, if your communities are already racial imbalanced, they don't have to integrate. But when we already, we're going to talk about this next class. All the housing discrimination and redlining and things that happened, that communities were already very well racially segregated. So that just allowed these communities to continue that segregation in schools, to the point that we think about the South being this the worst when it comes to segregation, but even today today the South is actually much more integrated than the North and the West, and that's because they were court ordered to integrate it, while the North and the West had all kinds of loopholes and ways to get around it. And actually, like New York City is the most segregated city in this country. So this is and we often find that the more Democrat, the more liberal areas are, the more segregated their areas are as well. And that all started, particularly, I mean, we did, Brown versus Board did a good job integrating busing. Busing was actually hugely successful, but we're going to talk about how a lot of people created narratives that it wasn't successful to kind of get rid of it. But that, we actually did a good job integrating up into the 80s, and then from the 80s, due to a bunch of court cases and a bunch of other reasons, we've been resegregating pretty fast in our schools. So definitely pause this for now, check out the thing, clip, and then come back, and we'll keep going. Okay, thank you. All right. So the next clip I want to play is this another short video, a little bit longer than the first couple, but it's the Atlantic did this a video on a clip on school integration, basically school choice programs, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about school choice through you know there's definitely ups and downs with school choice, but we're one of the main outcomes of school choice programs typically is it increases segregation and benefits white parents, more than other. And we actually have, I mean, some from DC's. Most people watching this are probably from DC, so we actually have a big system, a school choice system in DC. Something that I'm actually starting to get into with my children, and it's this is a complicated situation because it takes it's really easy to look at this not in a race neutral lens, like I just want the best for my kids, and then I'm told the best for my kids means test scores and things like that. But when you kind of take a step back, you realize that this is how we're perpetuating racism through these narratives, that it's just about best for kids, and through these narratives that we have to use racist testing, testing, which we're going to talk about standardized testing as being a terrible tool to judge performance, and how we devalue diverse cultural experiences for our kids while valuing test scores and things. So I mean, there's a lot to it. It's a very complicated situation, but we're going to spend a lot of time talking about school choice today. But I want to just play this clip just to give you kind of an idea of what a school choice program looks like.
The vast majority of white children living in the city have access to a high-performing neighborhood school. The vast majority of Black students have guaranteed access to nothing.
Do you think we're betraying the legacy of Brown v. Board?
Absolutely. We have defied it in every way that you can.
America's schools are the most segregated they've been in almost 50 years. And for decades, the federal government hasn't been doing anything about it. Today's typical white student attends a school that is nearly 3/4 white. The average Black student goes to one that's almost entirely students of color. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education declared that segregated schools should be dismantled with, quote, all deliberate speed. We're sliding back into the two unequal systems Brown promised to get rid of, one for low-income Black and Latino students, and another for more affluent white and Asian students. I went to speak with John King Jr., the department's first Black and Latino Secretary of Education. Since being appointed in 2016, he's taken a firm stand in favor of integrating schools.
My teachers could have looked at me when I was a kid and said, here's an African-American Latino male, family in crisis, going to New York City public school. What chance does he have? They could have written me off, but they didn't. They invested in me, and I want to make sure that all of our students have access to those opportunities.
Back when King was a student in the 1980s, schools were at their most diverse in history. Integration worked. In 1988, the achievement gap between Blacks and whites was half of its pre-Brown levels. No other education policy has ever come close to matching that success. So why'd we turn the other way?
There was significant progress in terms of creating schools that were more racially and socioeconomically diverse. But we have to acknowledge there were other places where that didn't happen and where there was real resistance.
Parents didn't want Black and Latino kids coming to their schools.
Ain't gonna be in my grandson's class. Not here, they ain't.
Some aggressively lobbied lawmakers and brought cases to the courts. Eventually, this resistance worked. Over the last 3 decades, school segregation has come back. The Department of Education was so discouraged that King's predecessors wouldn't even say the word desegregation for years.
The same blessing that saved my life, I want to make sure is available to more kids. Our challenge now is to approach this diversity work in a way that really lifts up voluntary, locally led efforts and accelerates those efforts.
King's plan isn't the forced busing of the past. Instead, he wants to make it easier for parents to send their kids to a school outside their neighborhood. This is called school choice. In this system, students of color can avoid bad neighborhood schools and apply for better ones across town. and white parents can choose to send their kids to more diverse schools than the ones nearby. The idea is that parents can voluntarily integrate schools. But it's not as easy as it sounds. Washington, D.C. has tried something similar, and it hasn't worked all that well.
School segregation is so bad that you literally can tell what school they're going to based on what color they are. Little black kids walking by themselves, they're going either to Langley, McKinley. White kids on a bike with their parents on a bike, they're headed this way to the Inspired Teaching School or Lee Montessori.
Natalie Hopkinson, a journalist and parent of two, has tried to get her two kids into largely white schools for years. They switched schools 5 times in 10 years. Eventually, she gave up and sent them both to private school.
When it comes to DC, race rules everything, and it's really depressing to me. The choice system very clearly disadvantages Black students because the schools that are high performing are in white neighborhoods, period. Families that are able to have the means to be able to buy into those neighborhoods have a guarantee they will have access to those schools.
The wealthier, mostly white schools in West DC have a small percentage of seats set aside for kids outside their neighborhood. But the lottery system is extremely complicated, and many low-income parents lack the know-how to compete for these limited number of seats.
Just think about that mother who has 3 jobs. How does she apply for 10 schools? Like I did even for my son. Like how does she go to visit 10 schools? First of all, because it's all during the day. You have to really understand how to look at spreadsheets. Even if they were well informed, there are not enough high performing schools for them all to fit in.
School choice is often used as sort of a euphemism when politicians want to say we want to integrate schools, but it's not the most politically palatable. Why do you think that's sort of a flawed approach?
You really kind of have to look back at Brown v. Board of Education and what happened. White people completely left. They just abandoned the system. So that was the choice that they made. If they keep relying on choice, they're going to be set up for failure because white people will not enroll their children in schools unless they're already white.
I put this challenge to King. Are we putting too much faith in parents?
I think we have to acknowledge some of the anxieties about school performance. So folks will say, I want to make sure that my child goes to a school that has strong academic programs. I'm worried that merging into another school or changing our school assignment policy will result in my child going to a school that is that offers less. Some of the anxieties can be overcome, but there has to be thoughtful leadership.
For the first time in decades, integration is back. But one has to wonder, if the federal government doesn't force it, can we really desegregate schools? As long as it's up to parents, it's going to be an uphill battle.
All right. So the main theme I want to get out, so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about school choice in this class, and the history of it and the different ways it looks like. But typically, when you first hear it, it kind of sounds like a nice program because especially in DC, like all the DC. The rich neighborhoods are very white and they have the best schools, and the poor neighborhoods are very Black and have the worst schools. So with school choice, it opens up for Black neighborhoods who can actually for a small few of them, they can actually send their kids to and with a lottery system, if they win, they can send them to these like nice rich white schools. The problem is no one in these nice rich white schools are actually sending their kids to these the Black schools. So because these schools are maintained as Black schools in poor neighborhoods, we're going to talk about this a lot today too, but typically majority Black poor schools are funded way less than white schools. So those schools continue to get defunded and receive less resources in these Black communities, while the white schools continue to get more. So it may, some Black kids may be able to get into these nice schools, but overall, typically these school choice programs, especially when they leave it up to parents to decide. Well, parents are always typically will choose what's best for themselves themselves and what's best for their kids. And then, even if they believe in integration, as we're going to talk about, a lot of white parents believe in integration, believe in racial justice and racial equality, but when it comes to their kids, they're willing to push segregation and school segregation. So that's why it's tough to just leave it up to parents, particularly white parents. We're going to talk about what happens when we do that. All right, so I have one more video I want to talk about. This is from Nicole Hannah-Jones, an interview on Democracy Now! So Nicole Hannah-Jones, she's an amazing writer. I mean, I think a lot of people know her from the 1619 Project. We play a lot of her stuff, articles and videos and interviews. But before that, she spent a lot of time researching school segregation for, I believe, the New York Times or the Atlantic, or one of those, or both. But she's done an extensive amount of research around school segregation, and then particularly that really peaked when her children all of a sudden became the age, and she had to decide what to do. She was living in New York City, and she had to decide if she wanted to go to the neighborhood school, or that wasn't was very black and wasn't supposedly has low performing, and or actually send their kids to a much nicer rich school because she had means. So she she's going to talk a little bit about that. She's going to talk a little bit about what school segregation means. It's going to set up a little bit of a context, because we're going to see a bunch of videos from her today. But I wanted, but she's going to be most of these videos. She's going to be referring to the article that she wrote that she's going to talk about today, or in this class, in this video.
That you wrote this story the same time as Charlottesville erupted. I just played Alabama's Governor George Wallace from 1963. We don't have to go back that far. Just a month ago in Virginia, hundreds of torch-bearing white supremacists, now they feel comfortable enough not to wear hoods, not to cover their identity, marched through the University of Virginia. A young woman was killed in the anti-racist rally by one of the white supremacists. Talk about your experience of writing this piece in the midst of this.
So it was interesting because on the one hand, all I write about is how racism still exists in this country and the many forms that it takes. And often there's a disbelief, I think, amongst readers that the problems are still this bad, that there are still large numbers of people in this country who are motivated by race. And so Charlottesville kind of burst that into the open. It was hard to deny because these weren't the way that many in the mainstream media described kind of the right and Trump supporters. These were not folks who looked like working class people in Appalachia, right? They looked very clean cut. They looked like someone who could be your office mate. And it ended up being a very violent event. I think my concern was, which is always my concern, and I tweeted about this, is, even during the civil rights movement, the white citizens councils, who were businessmen and very buttoned up, they despised the Klan because the Klan brought a certain type of heat and light to their much more sinister efforts to repress Black rights, which they did in a very civilized way. And so I think it was very easy for people to call out Charlottesville because that's the type of racism anyone can reject. But the things that I write about every day are not people walking around with torches and not people running over people in crowds. They are folks who would protest at a rally like that and then fight to keep their daughter out of a school like my daughter goes to.
Which brings us to the piece that you wrote a year ago, choosing a school for my daughter in a segregated city. We're not talking Tuscaloosa, we're not talking Birmingham, we're talking about New York City.
That's right. So New York City residentially is the third most segregated city in the country. And in terms of schools, it's among the most segregated large school systems in the country. And so there's a very cerebral disconnect in this community, in this city, where we call ourselves the Great Melting Pot, but we're not actually a melting pot. We're a diverse city and we're a very segregated city. And I had written about segregated schools since my very first reporting job back in 2003. But never as a parent. And then I found myself with my own child getting ready to start school in New York City, and then having to deal with, on a very personal level, what it is like to to try to make a school choice in a city that is very segregated and very unequal.
And so talk about the journey.
So I documented it. I actually never intended to write about my daughter's school. I've been writing about school segregation. People knew this was kind of my area of expertise. And meanwhile, my husband and I decide that we're going to enroll our daughter in one of the city's segregated high poverty schools. That it was important for me not to write that school segregation was wrong and that people needed to make choices for equity and justice, and then use my privilege to get my daughter into one of the city's few higher wealth and integrated schools. So we made the decision to enroll her in the segregated school, but didn't know that very quickly our daughter's school would become embroiled in its own integration battle.
So explain what you mean that it's a segregated school.
So my daughter's school is about 93% Black and Latino, and it is almost entirely free and reduced lunch. Its attendance zone is drawn around a federal housing project, and my husband and I are among a small handful of Black parents, middle-class parents who attend the school from outside of the attendance zone. So it is representative of the experience of large numbers of Black and Latino students in this district, which is they are isolated in schools with almost no white or Asian students and where every student is poor. So we intentionally decided to go into a school like that. Our school was under-enrolled, and less than a mile away was a very wealthy, predominantly white school that was bursting at the seams because in this city, as in many cities, if in a segregated system, white parents put their kids in the school with all the white kids. And so the school was very full. And because of that, the New York City public school system decided to send some of those white students to my daughter's school. And one can guess how those white parents felt about that.
We'll talk about the controversy. What happened?
Those white parents didn't want to send their children to this school, even though for many of them it was their neighborhood school. Many of them lived directly across the street from my daughter's school. So at this point, I was a parent and I was attending meetings.
And what grade was your daughter in?
She was just going in. She was in pre-K. So I was attending meetings where parents were white parents whose children were being rezoned from my daughter's school were fighting against coming to the school. They were saying many of the same things that I've heard in Gardendale and that I've heard in southern districts about why they didn't want to send their children into a heavily Black and Latino school. And I started to get a lot of it became a national news story because it's Brooklyn. And of course, the reputation of Brooklyn is that it is a very liberal borough and has very liberal white people. And so the headlines would be something like, white liberals fight integration. It was a story that got a lot of media attention. And people were emailing me like, are you going to write about what's happening at the school? Of course, not knowing that my daughter was in the school. So after a while, as all journalists, I think as writers, it becomes, you write because you feel like you have to. And so even though I didn't want to write a personal story, it felt impossible, knowing that I cover these issues all the time, not to write about what it was like to be right in the middle of one of these battles.
So it's a year since then, and where do the two schools stand?
Yeah, it's actually, so she was in pre-K at the time, and my daughter just started second grade. So it's been a while. But the New York City public schools did rezone large numbers of white parents to the school, and they haven't come. I don't know where they are, but they're not at my daughter's school.
And how is your daughter enjoying school?
My daughter's doing great. It's a beautiful school, and she's excelling academically, but more than that, she learns a lot from her classmates that other parents are afraid of, and she's doing great.
So what advice do you have for other parents who are choosing schools for their kids?
I think that what I always say is the inequality in New York City and other school districts is structural, but it also is upheld by individual choices. In my work, I'm not even trying to convince conservatives or Trump supporters to believe in integration. I'm trying to convince progressives who say they believe in integration to actually live their values.
All right. So yeah, we're going to watch a lot from Nicole Hannah-Jones throughout this presentation. She's just got to be one of the leading, experts on school segregation. But I think one thing that is important to remember, and we're going to keep on emphasizing this point, is that it's not just about diversity. It's not just about, well, let's bring those white kids into this Black school just so it looks more diverse. it's about this reality that unless there's enough white kids in a school, that school will not receive equal funding and will not have, equal opportunities, despite the, despite many attempts to create, separate but equal opportunities, which is actually unconstitutional because of Brown versus Board. Despite that fact, even, the best, chances, like, it's just, we're going to talk more about this, but like white schools just get, billions and billions of dollars and more funding and more opportunities, than black schools, regardless of poor and rich neighborhoods. So that's the importance of rezoning. And that actually, for the people living in DC, this same situation actually happened in Montgomery County, right over in Maryland, where in 2019 they were rezoning because they had multiple schools. The white schools were bursting at the seams and they needed, to expand, but then the black schools were a similar situation, underfunded, attended majority, living in poverty, free lunch. So they want to rezone it to kind of mix it up, and it's just same thing. Like, you watch these videos of these white parents, just like, it's, we're going to talk a little bit where that, that fear comes from and that anger comes from a little bit more today too. But there was a lot of opposition to this rezoning plan, and this rezoning plan was focused on, creating integration, and creating more quality. And we'll talk more about that. But I just wanted to mention that this is something that what her, Nicole Hannah Jones's experience is something that's happening all over this country. All right, so today's class, we are going to talk about a bunch of different topics. So we're going to spend like kind of the first half talking about the history of segregation and desegregation and resegregation. I'll start out, with segregation always, history always seems to start out in the South, and we'll talk about Jim Crow, talk about Brown, versus Board, civil rights case, and civil rights, bills and attempts to integrate, the resistance that. Particularly the Southern resistance, is what a lot of people are more familiar with. And then we'll talk about Northern resistance and Western resistance. We're going to talk about how this creation of this school choice was actually created through this, like, what we call, it was this era called mass resistance. Is actually what they called it. The politicians, the Southern, Dixiecrat politicians who were opposing, desegregation. They called this, a mass resistant campaign. And probably one of the most powerful tool that came out of that was this idea of school choice, and where they created this idea of, school choice. It can go, it by itself, it can go either way. It can, support, segregation. It can decrease it. It's a neutral, thing. But when you put school choice into an already very, segregated world, a racial hierarchy society, then what happens is it perpetuates and increases segregation. So that emerged from this movement, but it's something that's still being used today. So we'll the second half of this in course, we're going to talk about how since the 80s we have resegregated our schools, and how white parents, through school choices, has been the leaders of that movement. And then we're going to end with talking about possible integration solutions, and talking about how we can actually fight segregation, and how we can actually increase integration. All right.